Okay, for those of you that don't know, Persia is the ancient name for the territory encompassed by modern-day Iran. At its height under the Achaemenid rulers, which is basically the 6th and 5th century BC, the Persian Empire included territories found in Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, Russia, Iraq, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And just to give you an idea... Keep clicking. Oh, there we go. That's the Achaemenid Persian Empire. As you see, it's quite vast. And it's the largest empire known to the ancient world prior to Alexander the Great, who added Greece to it, which made it slightly larger than it is now. Now, although the terms Persia and Persian only actually appear in Ezekiel, 2 Chronicles, Esther, David and Ezra, ancient Persia played a significant impact on the other books of the Old Testament, including Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zedekiah and Malachi. And like many other aspects of biblical history and archaeology, the relationship between the Persian records and the Bible are still disputed. Some people argue that there's close links between the literary texts of Persia and the Bible, others say there's none whatsoever. So the aim of my paper then is to present some of the more revealing evidence that indicates the Bible narrative is actually correct and that it can complement rather than refute other Persian sources. I'll therefore make use of a variety of sources, including inscriptions, literary text, archaeological material, and so forth, from a variety of different cultures, including Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, Elam, and Media. And I've taken a chronological approach with this paper, as I think this is the most effective way of doing this. So I'll start by looking at Cyrus the Great and the evidence from the Bible for that period of Persian history, and then I'll move through to Artaxerxes I. I've established these as my chronological boundaries, as they're the main periods of Persian history covered in the Bible. And although there are other aspects outside of this time frame, I haven't really got time to go into them. Okay, so this is Cyrus the Great, and there's a variety of different ways of depicting him throughout history. And he lived from approximately 590 BC till approximately 530 BC, and he's also known as Cyrus the Elder, and he's considered the founder of the Persian Empire and the Achaemenid dynasty. As leader of the Persian people in Anshan, he conquered the Medes and unified the 2 separate Iranian peoples. And as king of Persia, he reigned over the new empire from around 550 until his death. Under his governorship, the empire expanded, eventually conquering most of Southwest Asia, much of Central Asia, Egypt, and into the Hellespont. And then into the east, he conquered as far as the Indus River. And as I said before, this created the largest empire the world had seen at this time. During his 29-year reign, Cyrus fought against some of the greatest states of the early classical period, and this included the Median Empire, the Lydian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, although he didn't quite venture into Egypt because he died fighting the Mazzageti tribe in around 530, so he never actually quite made it to Egypt, and it was his successor, Cambyses, which was to actually make it to Egypt. And between the years 546 and 540, Cyrus spent much of his time stabilising his reign and crushing various rebellions. So one of the big revolts that he had to put down was Babylon. So as part of his period of stabilisation, he invaded rebellious regions, and he implemented political, economic and social reforms. So being a powerful and rebellious state, Babylon was obviously a key target of his, and he undertook a campaign against the region in 539. And here we have various pictures of Babylon. And you can just see in the bottom one the American troops before they drove over it with tanks. So I'm not sure quite how much of that's still standing. Okay, so at the point that Cyrus begins his invasion, the morale of Babylon has hit rock bottom, and the people are depressed because of the complete neglect of their main city god Marduk. And this is down to the fact that Nabonidus, their king, has decided to abandon worship of Marduk, and he's decided to unexpectedly move to Timar in Arabia, and he'd been living there for 10 years at this point, so he completely abandoned the city, and he's left the rule of Babylon in the hands of his son Belshazzar. And this can account for the fact that in the book of Daniel we have Belshazzar as the de facto king rather than Nabonidus. So in anticipation of the growing Persian threat, though, Nabonidus hurriedly returns to Babylon, and he realises there's something big going on here, so he should actually make a return. And in 543, in a desperate attempt to maintain the loyalty of his subjects, and he collected together all the gods of all the different regions that were under his control, bring them into the city of Babylon and start trying to celebrate festivals in their honour. Okay, so here is Nabonidus. So after years of neglect, the king finally celebrated the New Year rites once again, but it was too late to win back the people or the priests. So they turn against him, and they don't actually revolt against him, but there's unrest, civil unrest, and there's disturbances in the city. And then according to the book of Daniel, Belshazzar was sacrilegiously using the vessels from the Jewish temple while celebrating a festival when the city falls. Cyrus comes along, and whilst this festival is going on, he sneakily invades the city. The clear implication of the passage is that the Persian attack caught the Babylonians by surprise. However, the statement has been questioned, and it's been argued that the size of army needed to storm a city as large and as vast as Babylon would be impossible to disguise or hide, so therefore it would take some vast oversight on the Babylonians to not actually spot an army of this size coming towards them. However, if we look at other sources, we find similar suggestions, and all these sources also point to the Babylonians being taken by surprise. Herodotus, in Book 1 of his histories, relates that at the time of the Persian invasion, the Babylonians were dancing and making merry at a festival. Similarly, we find in Xenophon's account in the Cyropedia that the Persians chose to attack during a certain festival, and I quote, when all the Babylonians were accustomed to drink and revel all night long. So although these are both Greek sources, and various scholars have questioned their accuracy and authenticity, and also the nature of the sources that they themselves used, we find the Nabonidus Chronicles confirming this view. And there's the actual chronicle, and I assure you that that is a language and not just someone hacking a chisel into a bit of stone. The Nabonidus Chronicle records the events during the rule of the last king of Babylon, King Nabonidus, hence its name, and this is records the invasion of Cyrus. Unfortunately, as you can see from the picture, the chronicles are currently damaged, and there are many blanks and spaces throughout the script, so we haven't got the complete script. The script, however, does describe how Cyrus's power was beginning to build up as he took over a number of city-states, and it lists his previous conquests. But in this account, it's also stated that the Persian troops entered the city on the 12th of October without actually having a fight. And further records that when Cyrus entered the city on the 29th of October, he was treated as a liberator, not as a conqueror. And the people come out and throw garlands onto the street and say, "What a great guy, you've liberated us from tyranny." And finally, we also have the Cyrus Cylinder, which proclaims that the Persians entered the city without a fight. And this is an important document, and I want to come back to that, and I'll show you a picture of it in just a minute. So what all these sources show us is that in this instance, the non-biblical accounts support that in the Bible. So it suggests that the city was taken unawares. Cyrus chosen to allow freedom of worship and even help restore destroyed sanctuaries. Cyrus went on to demonstrate his generosity by permitting the Jews to return to their ancestral homeland, a favour he also granted to other displaced people. And this again is recorded on the Cyrus Cylinder. And this here is the Cyrus Cylinder. And this was discovered by Rassam in the area of the Marduk Temple in around 1879, so we've had this for a fair while. The cylinder itself is an artefact consisting of a declaration issued by the Emperor Cyrus II of Persia, and it's inscribed in Akkadian, and it's on a clay cylinder. The cylinder is approximately 23 centimetres long, and it contains around 45 lines of text, and this is one of the most prized possessions of the British Museum. The contents of the cylinder, basically the first part is recording the criminal deeds of King Nabonidus, and then describing how the gods favoured Cyrus and helped him overthrow the Babylonians. The second section is all about royal protocol and genealogical tables. The third is sort of a peace decree, allowing deported gods to be returned to their sanctuaries and displaced peoples to return home. The fourth section is Cyrus thanking the gods for their protection. The fifth is a comment that hopefully under his reign the empire will flourish. And the sixth starts to record what building activities he's going to undertake in Babylon. Now the cylinder is interesting because not only does it back up the claims in the Nabonidus Chronicle that Cyrus was accorded this great and joyous welcome when he entered the city, but it also confirms the account in Ezra that Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to their ancestral homelands. Now, according to the book of Ezra, which is chapter 6, verse 8, Cyrus not only permitted the Jews to return, but also gave them carte blanche to take funds from the imperial treasury. Now, this statement has caused major controversy. They argue that it's one thing for a foreign invader to pay respects to the religions of people he's conquered, but it's something entirely different to actually fund the rebuilding of their temples at the state treasury. Also, the temple at Kargar, at the Oasis, and these were subsequently rebuilt from top to bottom. Or probably from bottom to top. Gardner also suggests that Cyrus can be found funding the rebuilding of the Inna temple at Uruk and the Enuma temple at Ur, and a variety of other smaller temples in Babylon. And this demonstrates an important point, and that is that we shouldn't judge the Bible on our own expectations, but on what it actually says. So we shouldn't think just because conquerors should be expected to not want to pay for the rebuilding of temples out of their treasury, that they don't. The Bible clearly states it does, and so do other sources. Okay, so I shall now move on to look at Darius, and that's Darius the Great. And he lived between around 549 BC and 485 BC, and he became king of Persia in around 522, and he came to power as the result of a bloody coup, and this was a coup which claimed the lives of both of Cyrus's sons. Now, Darius' early reign was marked by revolt. Babylonia revolted twice, Sicily 3 times, and the Greek cities along the Ionian coast, with the support of Athens, claimed their independence, and this act was to precipitate several ill-fated Persian expeditions against Greece. Now, Darius conquered the nations of the Pontic and Armenian mountains and greatly expanded the Persian influence. He also fought against the Sakar and other Iranian steppe tribes, as well as the Turanians from beyond the Oxus, and thus undertook a campaign to stabilise all of his borders. In the course of these campaigns, Darius made a number of military reforms, including introducing conscription, pay for soldiers, and specialist military training. Darius became known as being a great statesman and organiser who thoroughly revised the Persian system of administration and their legal code. And his revision for the legal code basically revolved around laws of evidence in court, slave sales, deposits, bribery, and assault. So these were all the areas that he looked at sort of changing. And it was through his reforms that he became the true successor of Cyrus the Great. He also divided the Persian Empire into 22 provinces, each under the supervision of a governor, or the Persian word satrap. And these satraps were usually a hereditary position and were largely autonomous, allowing each province its own distinct set of laws, traditions, and ability. Now, Darius is mentioned in Ezra, Haggai, Zechariah, as being the Persian king under whom the Temple of Jerusalem was finally reconstructed. Now, we know that Solomon's temple was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar in around 587, and although the Jews had returned under Cyrus, they hadn't laid the foundations of a second temple until around 536, and then work halted during the next 20 years in the face of opposition. And we know this because Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 to 5 tell us. The Bible then records that the Lord commissioned 2 prophets to stir the people back into action. These were Haggai and Zechariah. So some scholars have held now that there's an irreconcilable difference between Ezra and the reference in Haggai and Zechariah, as the former speaks of the foundation of the temple being in 536, and the later sources imply a second foundation in 520. And there's the argument, how can you have 2 foundation dates? However, dual foundation dates is not an unusual practice in Near Eastern culture. We have evidence that it was entirely possible to have more than one foundation ceremony for a particular building. Now, Wright points to a Hittite ritual that speaks of the refounding of particular temples, while we have a number of Akkadian texts that record the founding of a new, and this is in relation to a number of cult places. Therefore, perhaps the second refounding of a Jewish temple is not actually out of character. Now we find that the news of the reconstruction of the Jewish temple was carried to the Persian king by the Jews' neighbouring enemies. And we get in Ezra chapter 5 verse 3 that at that time Tatienai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Buzeni and their associates went to the king and asked, "Who authorised you to rebuild the temple and restore the structure?" Now originally those who argued against the historical accuracy of the Old Testament used this satrap as evidence to bolster their argument. They identified him as Ushtanu, the satrap of Babylon, who was also satrap of Trans-Euphrates. That was until Olmsted offered an alternative. Now Olmsted suggested that Tatienai, in a cuneiform document, was the one being referred to in the Bible, not the satrap of Trans-Euphrates. And this document recorded Tatienai as a figure who wasn't actually a satrap, but was just below that level. And although he was second in command, he was still vastly influential, and this document would again seem to support the biblical account. Now, further support for the accuracy of reporting by Ezra can be found in the language used in his record of Tatienai's letter to the Persian king. In this account, Ezra includes a significant number of Persian loanwords. Now, for those of you that don't know, a loanword is basically a word that we take into our language from a foreign language without any change or without any change in meaning. So, for example, we use the word déjà vu, which is from the French, and it hasn't undergone any change whatsoever. So we find this happening in the Persian account, in the biblical accounts. They're taking Persian words and just inserting them into the Hebrew. Furthermore, support for the biblical account was found in the Aramaic letters discovered at Elephantine, and I've got a picture of this. And this records that, thus too, the governor of the province of Trans-Euphrates, Tatienai, appealed directly to Darius, who curtly intervened in the religious affairs of an obscure settlement of Jews. So this clearly seems to be saying exactly what the Bible says. Now, Ezra also records that Darius responded to the inquiry of his governor. And Ezra states that King Darius then issued an order, and they searched in the archives stored in the treasury at Babylon, and a scroll was found in the citadel of Ecbatana in the province of Media. And this was what was written: Memorandum, in the first year of King Cyrus, in the reign of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifice, and let its foundations be relaid. Now, we get from this passage that first the order was to have a look in the treasury at Babylon, and when it wasn't found there, the scroll they were looking for, they then moved on to the citadel at Ecbatana. And this is interesting, as it seems to confirm the account that Cyrus gives us. And he states that he left Babylon in the spring of 538 to spend the summer in Ecbatana. So, therefore, there's some confusion as to where he was when he made the decree. So, it was originally thought it was in Babylon. When the scroll wasn't found where it was expected to be, they then moved on to Ecbatana, and lo and behold, that's where they found it. So this would seem to sort of confirm that this was what was going on with Cyrus's travelling. Ezra also records that Darius solemnly warned the enemies of the Jews against interfering with the rebuilding of the temple. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled down from his house and is to be lifted up and impaled upon it. And this is Ezra 6, verse 11. And here's a picture of that exact practice going on. The Persians weren't shy about impaling people. Herodotus records that a similar punishment was inflicted after Darius took Babylon, and in his account he states that the Persian king impaled 3,000 Babylonian troublemakers. This is also attested to in the Byzantine inscription, which records that a number of rebels were executed in this manner. So the threat and penalty in the biblical account corresponds precisely with the method of punishment used by the Persians at this time. And as a sort of footnote, the temple was finally completed in around March 12, 515, 70 years after its destruction. So it took the Jews 70 years to actually finish its rebuilding. So then we move on to Xerxes. And again, there's been a range of ways of depicting him throughout history. I think my personal favourite is from the recent movie 300, which has him as a 6'5" giant taking on the Spartans at Thermopylae. Now, Xerxes was king of Persia from around 485 until around 465, and he was son of Darius and Atossa, and she was the daughter of Cyrus the Great. After his succession in 485, He suppressed revolts in Egypt and Babylon, and these are sort of began just before he came to the throne, so he was actually clearing up from the previous reign. And Xerxes is best known for his invasion of Greece and the Battle of Thermopylae, as I said, recently immortalised in the film 300, and the naval battle at Salamis, and finally for the burning of the original Acropolis. And people have argued that without his actions we wouldn't have the Acropolis we have today. Now, Xerxes is the Persian king which is found in the book of Esther. And here we have some depictions of Queen Esther. And Esther is the heroine of the Bible book of Esther, which is named after her. For those that aren't aware of the story of Esther, it's basically about Xerxes falls out with his wife. She refuses to come to a banquet, so he demotes her or banishes her, depending on what interpretation you want to take. Esther then becomes his queen. She's not called before the king for a long period of time. One of the king's courtiers is plotting against the Jews. She finds out about it and is sent to plead the case of the Jews before the king. And in these times, if you weren't invited to see the king, he could actually have you executed for this. So it was a risky move. She seeks an audience without permission. The king falls in love with her again and says, "Okay, I'll grant you whatever you want." In the course of a banquet the next day, she reveals the plot. The Jews are saved, and she becomes sort of heroine of the Jewish people. So that's the book of Esther in a nutshell, basically. And in view of the book's setting being in Susa and its Persian background, its Aramaisms and its lack of reference to Palestine, there's widespread suggestion that the book was composed in the Eastern Delta, quite probably at Susa itself. And Susa was the old capital of Elam, and in 521 it was made the administrative capital of the Persian Empire by Darius. Although there has been much scholarly debate surrounding the date and authenticity of the book of Esther, it is interesting that the biblical account matches so well with the Greek sources. Now, our main Greek source for this period is Herodotus. For those of you who aren't historians, Herodotus was a native of Halicarnassus, which is in modern-day Turkey. He was a Greek historian from the Ionian coast. He is often regarded as the father of history, and is exclusively known for his writing of a book entitled The Histories. And this book records his inquiries into the origins of the Greco-Persian War. And his narrative becomes especially important for this period, as it is the only detailed account of a period that is otherwise unrecorded. So one of the arguments that we get levelled at Esther is that it's a historical novel, and that it's written much later than the Achaemenid period. However, even those scholars who do suggest that the work is a later composition concede that the author is intimately acquainted with the Persian background of the book and the purported period. Berg, for example, who is one of the people that argue that it is a historical novel, notes, "The author's familiarity with both general and specific features of Persian life during the Achaemenid period also lends credence to the story. Furthermore, the story's intimate knowledge of Persian court etiquette, public administration, and the like strengthens the impression of its accuracy." Another historian states, "Esther has an excellent familiarity with Persian law, custom and language in the Achaemenid period." Rudolf Meyer, meanwhile, observes that Esther portrays an accurate knowledge of chronological data, the topography of Susa, palace protocol, court intrigues and the like. And finally, Patton and Moore, on their commentary to Esther, list an array of customs that point towards the story being an accurate account. And I quote, "On the other hand, there is a fairly universal agreement amongst scholars that the author of Esther generally shows an intimate knowledge of Persian court etiquette, public administration, economics, and so on. If the author's tale does not mirror historical reality, it is indeed very, very well imagined." Now, these sentiments are mirrored by my colleague, Dr. Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, and he works extensively on Persian court life, and he says that the familiarity that the author of Esther has means that it can only have been written at that period. There's no question that it's got a later composition. The evidence is just too overwhelming. Court etiquette and court life changes so quickly during this period that the moment in time that's described in Esther would have been lost, and it's got to have been written at the time. And a linguistic analysis seems to offer support to this hypothesis. Especially striking are the 30 or more personal names of Persian or Elamite origin, and the 12 Persian loanwords that I've already sort of talked about. In contrast to the confusion that reigns in the spelling of these names in Greek and Latin texts, the Book of Esther has preserved the Persian names with remarkable accuracy. Further evidence for the book's authenticity can be identified in its recording of personal names for the important Persian officials. And I've got a list of these. As you can see, the list provided in Esther is fairly comprehensive, and it can be supported by the Elamite Persepolis texts. Now, these might not look to the untrained eye like being particularly similar, but linguistically they are fairly similar, I am assured. And this great care taken with recording these names is in marked contrast to the practice of even Josephus, who omits such long lists of unpronounceable names as "not to bore my reader." So Josephus sees the recording of this type of information as dull and boring and not necessary to the recording of history, whereas the writer of Esther records the names fairly diligently. Now, I haven't really got time to go into sort of linguistic analysis and explain why all of these names match the names on the other side, but if anyone is interested, then Stafford White's book and some articles are really, really useful, and I can refer you to them at the end. Now, another serious discrepancy cited by scholars trying to discredit the historicity of Esther is the fact that Herodotus, in Book 7, chapter 6, indicates that Xerxes' queen was a mistress, and this is in contrast to the Bible recording the name as Vashti. And here we have some different depictions of Queen Vashti and a mistress. Now, a mistress was a very powerful, vengeful and influential woman at the Persian court, and we see this in her reaction to the affair that took place when Xerxes was in Sardis. Now, Xerxes, having come back from Greece, and in a move worthy of anyone on the Jerry Springer show, falls in love with his brother's wife. He chases after her. She says, "I'm not interested, I'm married to your brother." So he goes, "Well, in that case, can I have your daughter?" So there's an arrangement takes place, and he actually marries his brother's daughter. Having fallen for this girl, he then makes the cardinal mistake of giving her a robe made by his wife. And this sets into motion a series of events which ultimately ends with the mistress having the young girl's mother taken away and mutilated in front of her. And when I say mutilated, this is to have her eyes poked out, her ears and nose and mouth cut off, and her breasts cut off. And she's then left to live like this. It's the most disgraceful punishment the Persians could inflict, because it didn't actually kill you. You were left to live with the shame of being mutilated. Now, again, Stafford White, who does all the linguistic analysis for this period, has suggested that by assuming certain phonetic modifications, an identification of Vashti with a mistress is easy to make, and this conclusion has been widely accepted now. So it's now believed that these two characters are the same person. And as I said, if you want the reference, I'm quite happy to speak to you at the end and give you the reference. But scholars have then said, okay, well, we can now identify these two people as being one and the same, but there's a chronological problem with the Book of Esther in that there's a gap. Now, clearly, in chapter 1, verse 3, this is the third year of Xerxes' reign, whereas by the time we get to chapter 2, verse 16, that's clearly the seventh. Now, we've skipped 4 years. So what's going on here? Now, if we synchronise this with Xerxes' absence while undertaking his campaign in Greece, we notice that the 4 years would seem to correspond exactly. So David Klein therefore notes that the 4 years between the deposition of Vashti and the installation of Esther as queen in the 7th year would coincide precisely with the 4 years Xerxes was absent from Persia. Now, it's difficult to be undertaking a campaign in Greece and also be getting married in Persia, so that would give us this 4-year gap. And a further argument that has been put forward in dispute of the accuracy or authenticity of the text in Esther is that a mistress clearly wielded power when her son Artaxerxes came to the throne in 464. Now, unfortunately for us, Herodotus breaks off his account of Xerxes' reign at the end of 479, and he only provides a very brief description of the events that took place upon the king's return from Greece. This is outside of his interest. Once the Greeks and Persians have stopped fighting, that's it. He's not really bothered. So this means we can't use Herodotus to work out what's going on. And some scholars have suggested, well, if Vashti is important under the reign of her son, then she can't have been executed or disgraced as the biblical account suggests. However, it's worth noting that the actual biblical account never says that she was executed. Now, this is something that people have taken for granted, that if she was standing in opposition to the king, then the likelihood is he'd have executed her for her rebellion. However, this isn't actually stated, and it's therefore more likely that she was demoted to the status of lesser wife, whereas before she was great wife, she's now just lesser wife, and that she just became another member of the harem. And this is especially likely as she was mother to Xerxes' heir. So you're not going to want to put to death the mother of your heir, and it would be very bad policy. It reflects badly upon the dynasty if you're executing the mother of your legitimate heir. So it's likely then that if a mistress did remain as part of the king's harem, it would be extremely easy for her to regain her position of influence and prestige when her son comes to the throne. So she stays in the background, waits for the king to die. When he does, her son comes to the throne and she can once again retake her place. Another obstacle which has been put forward to accepting the account of Esther as a historical document is a statement by Herodotus that the Persian queen could only be drawn from the 7 leading families of Persia. And this is in Book 3, Chapter 84. Now, this is a far easier discrepancy to dismiss, as Herodotus contradicts his own hypothesis when he records that Amestris was the daughter of Onatanes, and he wasn't from one of these families, so we already have a discrepancy straight away. Additionally, we know that other Persian kings, such as Darius, married from outside these 7 families, so why do we have to accept his account for Xerxes? And then finally, other supporting evidence which we can use to support the biblical account can be found in the reward that the high official Haman suggests to Xerxes when the king wished to bestow favour upon Mordecai. Haman, believing the reward to be for himself, suggests that, and I shall read, to whom would the king delight to do honour more than to myself? So he suggests to the king, for the man the king delights to honour, let royal clothing be bought which the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rides out on, and place on his head the crown which the king himself wears, and let the clothing and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that the array of men therein may delight in the king's favour and see what glory this man has achieved. Now this reward mirrors precisely that of the exiled Spartan king Demetrius, who, when commanded to choose a gift for himself, asked to be permitted to ride in state through Sardis, wearing the king's tiara, just like the Persian king, and to have people out there claiming how great and wonderful he is. So the two systems of honour here seem to correspond exactly. And a further piece of evidence which points to the accuracy of the account can be found in the discovery of an incense burner at Lachish. This isn't the actual one because I can't find the actual picture I have, but this is a similar sort of artefact. Now, as part of her beautification process before being presented to the king, Esther is described as being seated near a cosmetics burner which impregnated her and her clothes with a chosen fragrance. And that's chapter 2, verse 12. Now, this is the only literary reference we have to Persian queens using incense burners during this particular time frame. Now, prior to the discovery at Lachish, this statement was cited as evidence to support the hypothesis that the Book of Esther was a later composition. Scholars suggested that the book was written retrospectively, and that the reason this was included was because it was written after the time that the trade with Arabia had really taken off. So this was becoming common practice at the time when the book was written, and therefore they were putting contemporary practices back into ancient Persia. However, the discovery of this disproves that. We now have a piece of datable material at exactly the right time frames, saying that what the Bible is sort of describing is going on. Right, so then to briefly look at Artaxerxes. Now, Artaxerxes is the Persian king associated with Ezra and Nehemiah. Soon after coming to the throne, he was faced with a major revolt in Egypt, and this was to last over a decade. Now, this revolt was supported by the Athenians, and again precipitated a number of skirmishes between the Greeks and Persians. The ultimate outcome was that in 450, as both states became war fatigued, they signed a peace accord known as the Peace of Callias. However, just prior to the Peace of Callias, Artaxerxes commissioned Ezra, a Jewish priest scribe, to take charge of the ecclesiastical and civil affairs of the Israelite nation. Now, we've got this commission recorded in Ezra 7, verses 13 to 28. And here we have some various depictions of Ezra. Now, the rebuilding of the Jewish community in Jerusalem had begun under Cyrus the Great, and as I've already said, he permitted the Jews to return home after their captivity in Babylon. However, Artaxerxes took a great interest in Ezra's undertaking, so not just saying, go and do this, he actually took a personal interest, and granted him his requests, and gave him a number of gifts for the house of God. Having received these gifts and the king's blessing, Ezra assembled a band of approximately 5,000 exiles to return to Jerusalem, and they left in the first month of the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign, and this works out to approximately 455 BC. Now, after his arrival, Ezra notices that contrary to the Jewish law, most of the Jews, even those of high standing or who were priests, were marrying non-Jewish girls and pagan women. And Ezra now is recorded as taking strenuous measures against such marriage and insists upon the dismissal of such wives. Now, unfortunately, we get no further record of what Ezra does until we find him reading the law after the rebuilding of the wall by Nehemiah. Ezra then is recorded as bringing the book of Moses to the assembly, and on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra and his associate reads the Torah aloud to the entire population, and this takes from morning till midday. So there's about a 7-hour session of having the laws read to them. And it is at this point that the Bible records a great religious awakening occurs. Now, there's been seen as a number of problems with this account. The fact that Artaxerxes commissioned Ezra, a mere scribe, to administer the law to his people has troubled a number of scholars. However, this in itself is something that I'd expect to find. We have a very close parallel of a similar practice and a similar commission being given by Darius I to Ujahossenet, an Egyptian priest and scholar. Now we have this guy's funerary monument, and this is the man himself. Now Ezra's mission can therefore be seen to correspond precisely with the two aspects of Ujahossenet's commission, and that is basically the restoration of occult or national and dynastic sites and the reorganisation of judicial institutions. Now, this guy, although he's a priest, is mainly known for being a scribe, and that's exactly what we know about Ezra. So the two are fairly similar. And we also find that Darius was actively concerned with not only imperial laws to be disseminated throughout his empire, but also with local laws and traditions, and he takes a personal interest into local practices. So in addition to charging this guy with the task of going out and restoring public buildings and temples, he also writes to his satrap in Egypt and instructs him to collect together the wise men of the realm and to make a new set of laws. So this is perhaps how we should understand the efforts of Ezra and Nehemiah. We should see them as being given the commission of going out, rebuilding the temple, calling together the Jewish religious leaders and influential men, and thrashing out a new set of regional laws which would work in conjunction with the laws passed across the empire. Right, so I shall now move on to briefly explore one of Ezra's contemporaries, Nehemiah, cupbearer to Artaxerxes. And we have a number of pictures there. Now, although to you guys the title cupbearer does not probably sound like a particularly high honour, this was actually, in biblical times, a very important position. In classical sources such as Xenophon, we find descriptions of cupbearers in the Persian court. And when I say cupbearers, I don't mean like your coffee mug of the morning. I mean things like that. And this is a silver drinking horn, and this is an average Persian king's cup. And the cupbearer was expected to actually test the purity of the liquid contained within it. So take a sip. The king would wait and see if he passed out. If he did, obviously that was poison, and you're not going to drink from that. If he didn't, then he'd get he'd take a swig. But we also know that because Persian kings considered themselves to be pure and to be almost God's representative on earth, he had to maintain his purity. Therefore, we find accounts of like a king finds an eyelash in his water, and he brings his cupbearer forward and he says, "Okay, I found an eyelash in this. This is not acceptable." And the cupbearer goes, "Oh no, it's him over there. He gave it to me, and I'm pretty sure that it was his fault." So they have this bit of an argument backwards and forwards, and the king says, "Well, seeing as we can't actually determine which one of you is guilty, right, execute them both." So the position of cupbearer was vitally important. It isn't a lesser honour at all. It's actually a really significant honour. So by having this position, we know that Nehemiah is, by implication of his position, to have been well trained in court etiquette. He was to be handsome. The king didn't surround himself with ugly people. He picked the most handsome men of the day. And he also had the skills to be able to select the best wine, so that the king was always had the best wine cellar, and that he was a good companion, so he could talk to the king. He wasn't just expected to sit there in silence. He was expected to converse with the king, chat about matters of state and affairs, and be sort of up to date on what's going on throughout the empire. So we know then that Nehemiah would likely have been a man of great influence and had really close access to the king. Above all, he would have enjoyed the unreserved confidence and trust of the king, something which he would rely on when rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Now this, if we skip forward slightly to the actual rebuilding, the fact that the king is trusting this guy with providing him with his food and water, things which were easily poisoned, shows what high trust he placed on Nehemiah. So therefore, when Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls and says, we're not doing this as an act of rebellion, we're doing it because that's what we've been instructed to do, Artaxerxes is willing to trust him because they've had this close friendship. Now, if they hadn't have had this close friendship, it's less likely that he would have been allowed to continue with his project. Right, so having gained this position of influence, he's then sent out to become governor of Judah. And Kurt Galling has taken issue with this statement and says, well, there were never any governors in Judea at any point in Persian history, so why should we accept that Nehemiah becomes the governor? Now, he suggests that the Bible is actually mistaken when it says Nehemiah was sent to become governor of Judah. He suggests that Judah never had a governor, and that the governorship that is being referred to is that of Samaria. However, archaeological data has again proven this idea wrong. In 1974, a collection of 70 clay seal impressions and 2 seals of unknown provenance were brought to the archaeologist Naaman Avigad and presented before him. And he was quick to spot that one of the seals bears the inscription YHD, and this is the Persian designation for the province of Judah. Now, these seals can be confidently dated to the 6th and 5th centuries on the basis, and on this basis then, Avigad bought the collection and sifted through it. And he therefore found that there was a number of these seals or coins with this on it, and he then tentatively proposes that they're the governors of Judah that we know of. So whereas prior to this they were saying, well, there was never any governors, due to this one collection of seals and coins, we can now put these guys into a fairly rough, but we think correct sort of chronology. So having overcome this obstacle, another obstacle was to raise its head. And objections were then made to the fact that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah record that the boundaries for Judah at this period were quite large. Now, because the province of Judah were thought to be greatly reduced in the Persian era, questions were raised then over the accuracy of the biblical account, and historians have said, well, that's way too large a territory to actually be correct. This is obviously the Israelites bigging up their importance in the surrounding area, saying how important they are to the Persian Empire, and making themselves sound a lot better than they actually were. However, again, archaeology is slowly but surely proving this idea wrong. Archaeological evidence, in particular the discovery of coins and seal stones, seem to offer further confirmation to the Bible's accuracy. Excuse me. Ephraim Stern suggests that the distribution of stamps and coins which are imprinted with the official stamp of the Jewish province in the Persian period correspond exactly with the boundaries as recorded in the various lists in Ezra and Nehemiah. So all our finds are on exactly the borders and boundaries which the Bible states that they should be. Now, Stern also points out that the discovery of border fortresses revealed in archaeological surveys, in particular those in the Hebron Hills, coincide again exactly with where the Bible says they should be. So archaeology is saying, well, actually, the Bible is right. We can't see these as overinflated thoughts of grandeur. This isn't the Israelites bigging themselves up. This is actually fact. We've now got forts along the borders that we thought that there should be. So once again, all this evidence supports to the accuracy of the Bible. Now, the Bible then records that the Israelite exiles returned to a tiny enclave surrounded by hostile neighbours. To the north they had the Samaritans, the Ammonites to the east, the Arabs and Edomites to the south, and the Phoenicians to the west. So they're sort of like an island in the middle of hostile states. Now we know that there had been opposition to the rebuilding of the great temple during the reign of Darius, and this opposition intensified as Judah's neighbours discovered Nehemiah planned to rebuild the city walls. Now, people didn't like having towns with walls around them, because this means that if you wanted to take them down, if they went into rebellion, you had to besiege them. And sieges in the ancient world were a hit and miss affair. Unless you actually had someone on the inside opening the gates for you, they could be very long and costly. So it made people nervous if you had a neighbour who was building walls around their city. So we get opposition, and we find Nehemiah has a lot of opposition to the rebuilding of his walls. Now the Bible records that the main opponents to Nehemiah's scheme were Sanballat, the Samaritan, Tobiah, the Ammonite, and Geshem, the Arab. Now, again, early scholarship suggested that these men were probably fictitious symbols of opposition. So these guys were sort of created as a way of sort of symbolising that the Samaritans were not particularly happy with this, and the Arabs weren't particularly happy with this. So they created these fictional characters to embody that. However, again, archaeology seems to support the biblical account. In a hallway of a temple discovered in the region of Amun, and which has recently been carbon dated to the Persian period, 2 inscriptions have been found that record the name of Tobiah. But more startling is the evidence for Geshem the Arab. An inscription from Dedan in northwest Arabia reads, Geshem, governor of Dedan. Furthermore, 2 silver vessels inscribed in Aramaic near the Suez Canal also bear the name Geshem. On one cup is the inscription Geshem, son of Shahar, whilst on the second is the phrase Kunu, son of Geshem. So this is strong suggestion that this was an influential man who did actually exist. Now, despite attempts to prevent him from doing so and an economic crisis, Nehemiah was eventually able to complete the construction of the walls, and Jerusalem once again became a walled citadel. Now, although we have vast archaeological evidence for the walls of Jerusalem and them being destroyed and rebuilt on a number of occasions, the stratigraphy and chronology is difficult to interpret. But again, slowly but surely, archaeologists are suggesting that we now do have walls at the right time frame for this, and that we can actually see at various places around Jerusalem the walls which Nehemiah built. So just a few brief conclusions then. What I hope that I've begun to demonstrate tonight is that far from being an inaccurate group of fantasy stories, the Bible is actually quite accurate in its account. We have a lot of evidence from other cultures, such as Assyria, Babylon, even Greece, which support the biblical account. And we have lots of different types of material, so we're not relying just on literary texts. We've got archaeology, we've got inscriptions, epigraphy, numismatic evidence. All of this seems to suggest that the Bible account is right. So one of the things that I hope that I've sort of shown is that a lot of times scholars go in with this expectation, historians approach things with the expectation that because this is how we think it should happen, it happens. And the example I used at the start, with we wouldn't expect a conquering power to provide money to rebuild a temple, we shouldn't go into the study of history with that expectation. And when we go into this with an open mind, we actually find some interesting parallels, cross-cultural parallels. So that's my speech.
Thanks very much. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome. Yep.
As a scholar, do you put more weight on the Bible in terms of veracity, or do you just treat it the same as non-biblical accounts?
I treat it, well, I suppose when I started I treated it exactly the same, and I'd like to hope that I still do. My specialty for most of the Near Eastern stuff was chronology. I did a lot of work on David Roll's stuff, looking at the chronology, which is what I spoke on last time. And that was before I was a Christian. That was before I became a Christian. So I'd gone out there with a completely open mind. In fact, if anything, I'd probably gone out there to prove the Bible wrong and say actually it's not a very accurate source, and it's an entirely pointless waste of time to try and read it as such. I was actually convinced the opposite. I actually found that the more I read And the more I looked at it in terms of like Assyrian culture and Egyptian culture, the more there was a number of parallels. So I'd like to think that I still treat it as a historical document, and that's how I try and approach this. But obviously, I think there's probably a degree of bias, like any historian has a degree of bias over their source material.